So my group focused on global disinformation threats on two different axes. So the first axis that we had was between ideological and non-ideological or financial threats. The other axes ranged from less powerful and less congregated to more powerful and more congregated threats. So in terms of like more ideological and more congregated threats, we were looking at state actors, so state acting media. This would be things such as Channel 1, Sputnik, Press TV, GRU, and VOA. In terms of like financial but still more powerful threats, we're looking at commercial influence, such as Big Tobacco, Sinclair, and Breitbart. In terms of less powerful but more ideological, we have the grassroots troll movements. So we're looking at things like the QAnon, the WhatsApp mobbing in India, that sort of thing. And in terms of financial but less powerful movements, we're looking at affiliate marketers. So we're looking at, there was a group of Macedonian teenagers who spread information to basically just for clicks to get more money and scamming people, general fraud sort of things. So the techniques that they use to do these things are things like, from state-sponsored media, we're looking at TV and radio stations, more traditional media. That's the same thing for the commercial side. So that's more traditional media along with funding certain scientific studies. The more non-traditional types of techniques comes from the less congregated areas. So that comes from the market affiliates and the grassroots trolls. So that's like huge campaigns from the grassroots trolls who all attack a certain person, such as on Twitter. It's also with the bots in the grassroots troll area. With the affiliate marketers, more telemarketing, that sort of thing. So, interventions for these ways that they're spreading misinformation. When it comes to affiliate marketers, so that's less congregated and less ideological tactics. We're looking at ad tech reform. In terms of the less congregated and more ideological tactics, we're looking at stronger age regulations because a lot of like the 4chan area trolls are targeting teenagers. We're also looking at higher enforcement of the standards, community standards. In terms of state-sponsored media, that could be its own session, but a lot of that is just involved in diplomacy. And in terms of commercial influence, there's actually a lot that we can do there. So a lot of that is like political money transparency and transparency within like trade and stuff. There's one overarching concept that we really talked about though, and that was media literacy. And there's a lot of different ways we can spread that. It was mentioned earlier that we could do that through education, but we can also do that through like public libraries. That's it. Thank you.
That's great. Next presentation, AV team, if you will. How it's made, fake news, FakerFact. FakerFact, please come up.
Y'all want to get a picture of that? As we had our workshop, my teenage son made the slides. So, so wish me luck. Much kofifi. Okay, this is his particular approach to creating fake news among his friends. They download GIMP, and this is Shamu the whale with a chainsaw. He's about to cut to the side of the thing and go into the audience with it. NASA recommends the chainsaw. This is where we're getting into what we really did. So there are certain tactics that people use to help things spread fake news and real news, and I am the demon in the room because I'm a growth hacker, and that's what people hire me to do. That's what FakerFact hired me to do. So you start with a group of people, say your friends, or if you look at Pizzagate, they went to planting seeds in a chat room. So a lot of the fake news starts in chat rooms, and you need a few people to give it traction initially so that I know Phil talked about the bots. They'll get a bot to... All right. So the bots will retweet it a whole bunch of times until it gets picked up by the mainstream media, and then they'll do a story on it. So you can give it legitimacy that way. Confirmation bias is a big thing. Once you hit that group of people that that want that story, they're going to respread it, especially if it has sort of a gossipy or a novel approach to it that they think is interesting. Then they're going to repost it. We're back to the bottom one. The humor or the novelty is probably going to get some reposts. I also can't see that. Oh, and the visuals can give it legitimacy. So if it's got a good visual, like the ones we just saw, then it's going to get reposted more often. And if the photo seems real and not fake. Another thing was if almost everybody in the room agreed that if there was an authority who had been quoted in the article, it gives it more legitimacy and they would feel more comfortable sharing it. And and then emotionally triggering words was another thing that several people have spoken about, things like shockingly, or the trolls in Macedonia that the young lady just referenced. They would take a regular news article and make some dramatic headline to turn it into clickbait. So that was a big way that things got shared. And then we had a whole list of ideas of how to slow down people from sharing it. Starting with targeting people who are willing to listen, because some people are at a far end of one end of the spectrum or the other, and no matter what you say, if FakerFact, our website, says that it's not true, they're just going to write that off. Well, FakerFact is crazy. That's not it at all. Another way we thought might help was that if you have posted something, and we probably all done it, posted something that turned out later to be wrong, that you honestly go back and say, hey, everybody, I posted this, and it turned out not to be true, so I fell for it. You know, this is the whole thing with, like, the elders getting scammed. If there's awareness of it, it might slow people down a little bit. If we put dates on the stories so that we would know, well, this story was written, 7 years ago, so it's not really applicable anymore, that would be helpful. Also, tracing the sources back to the original article, or the original source, the primary source, so that you can find out what was actually said under what conditions instead of taking it out of context. Also, if you wanted to discuss it with somebody, you could post links about the same article from a more reputable source, so that would disrepute the person who's supporting the ridiculousness. Asking people regularly, what's your source? And something that maybe the platforms would be able to do is a way to not boost things, because sometimes someone will put some incendiary comment under something just to give it traction, just to get people to argue with them. And if there's a way that Facebook and Twitter and other people, once they start arguing and all of those people start into that particular topic on that particular link, if there was a way that the platforms could not prioritize that, it would help. Because if they're just trying to stir up trouble, it's actually a marketing tactic. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are fighting with a legitimate person. It easily could be somebody who's been planted there. Stories about how fake news has damaged people. Everyone in the room felt like it was the WhatsApp issue with India had been really effective in making everyone more aware of how damaging it can be to spread fake news. So probably if the news media could pick up more stories about how the damage that had been done on a personal level to people because of fake news, that would be a way to slow it down. And these days there's an AI app, but you could also embed the metadata in a way so that if you're looking at a picture of something that's been misrepresented, then the AI app or the metadata could be put in a way so that you can see the text that's associated with that. Like, this is a person at a celebration crossing the street, and that would offset the idea that this is a guy with an ISIS flag after the World Cup, that kind of thing. On a lower level, to keep those emotional words from being such a trigger, if we could all give maybe some emotional management classes to our kids and ourselves, that would slow things down as well. That is the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. And FakerFact. That was really great. Thank you. Let's see who we have next. Credco. And they have slides today. Amazing. Samantha from Credco.
Yes.
Take it away.
Yes, I am. I don't work for Credco. I was just an attendee for this workshop, but I feel like I learned a lot. And Credco is really open to feedback from people and interaction and contribution. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that our group leaders sort of brought up. We broke into groups and had a lot of ideas surrounding these central concepts. So I'm not going to go into all of those various ideas. But one of the first things that we talked about is something Credco is working on, the idea of basically coming up with a nutrition label for a news article and attaching that label to the article. In this slide, you can see an example of a US nutrition label compared to one in the UK. I personally did not know that the UK one is so much better. To me, it's way more understandable. Just as a quick summary, that red section has sort of like a dangerous or an unhealthy amount of sodium or whatever that is. One of the things we talked about was how to make it legible. So if you were going to do this idea, if you're going to make a nutrition label for news, how would you implement it and what would you want it to show? So we talked about maybe a few indicators of journalism like transparency or sources or a few of the other elements of journalism that you might want to track, but also how would you make it readable to the reader and how would you implement it? So one thing that I think Farida mentioned was that you probably would want to incorporate designers because, for instance, this UK label I'm guessing had designers involved, whereas the US one maybe not so much. So they have a website there on the slide. If you are interested in this idea of coming up with nutrition labels or how those could be implemented, if you follow that link, it's just credweb.org/CCIV, or you could just go to credweb.org. They have a list of a lot of the indicators they're thinking about, and they're looking for more contribution and ideas related to that. One of the other things we talked about was how to not just verify an image, but how to study it in sort of a wider context. So I come from a journalism background, and there's a lot of emphasis on verification. Oh, we're missing a couple slides, that's okay. There's a lot of emphasis on verifying an image, like making sure that it's quote-unquote real and that it does show what it pertains to show. But it also might be even more important to know the context of the distribution of it. So if it's a real image of Syria, for example, who shared that image? So not just what Twitter, but like which groups on Twitter. And then ideally you would want to find out why they shared it. So Farida presented this, actually it's borrowed from art history apparently, but it's a way to analyze a photo or an image and basically learn a lot from it to give you a lot more context to work with. I'll pause to let Jenny take a photo. So we focused a lot on context as well as the source. And then when you get into things like memes, where they add text or they add maybe fake context or other context to that, basically how do you deal with that and incorporate it? So these are also things that I think are very open for discussion, and they would like to get feedback and contribution on. So if you have any thoughts on that, or if you'd like to get, I know you couldn't really read that wheel. If anyone wants a copy of that, I think come see Credco. That's all. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. Fun fact, the unofficial mascot of Credco is the Credible Hulk. Eye rolls and groans. And with that, next slides, please. Pie in the Sky, media literacy programs.
I know you're all thrilled by that amazing picture of a literal pie in the sky, right? Give me one. I don't know. Media literacy. Let's check this. So my name is Jessie Hollis McCarthy. I'm with NewseumED, and I had the pleasure of leading this breakout session. And one, my group left before we came up with the title, but two, we use this term a lot, and it was our jumping off point. What are the ultimate highest goals we want in the education or creating things around media literacy? You know, what is the ultimate dream? What is the highest we can reach for? And our brilliance was contributed by these individuals or individuals from these organizations here. And we focus on the question of how can we build support for a media literacy push across society, and what combination of news organizations, tech companies, and education groups can be assembled to drive that work? And we did. We jumped in with what would be our ultimate dream looks, and I know you can't read them, but we looked at things like power having truth spoken to it. Everyone everywhere has to detect propaganda and wants to. And as we synthesize all of our ultimate goals, we came out with these sort of three key things: that everyone everywhere participates in productive conversations based on respect for others' knowledge and expertise, an understanding of why being informed matters, and a desire to be challenged and become more informed. And then we wanted to look at practical things these players in this conversation can do through some approaches. And we looked at both the idea of local community-based organizations and technology-based things like social media platforms. If you want to see our brainstorming, someone was kind enough to share it on Twitter, and you can see it on the NewseumED Twitter, our brainstorming posters. But we sort of started playing around with social media platforms making an incentive or some sort of badge or something to encourage the idea of a truth identity. So being a truth finder part of who you are and what you share on social media, and sort of meters of engagement, ways to follow and track that. And then we looked at sort of community-based organizations and how could we bring them into that bigger push with this universal statement of shared values, or creating some sort of umbrella organization or group or conference that these organizations could come to and share, and local teams leading to all these different local environments. But some of the challenges we saw in this is there's this challenge between wanting a media literate society as an empowerment of democracy and trying to create these ultimate programmatic goals or these ultimate creations where one person tells other people what to do to achieve this, and that's about as undemocratic as it gets. And so one participant posited this idea of we need to find a way to create one seed that everyone gets onto that blooms 1,000 flowers in these local community organizations. And with that in mind, we jumped into what could we agree on, and there became this idea of what programs could be created that were collaborative as opposed to competitive across these different organizations, and what that would look like. Forgive me, let me get the notes up. And this is where we really went big. So we went big or go home on this one. So we saw a federal education mandate so that it became a national trend, or maybe a step down from that, and we set a cool media literacy holiday that everyone could jump onto and participate on or create programming around. There was a suggestion of a new nonprofit social media platform strictly for utilizing, teaching, and transmitting media literacy, one that's not out to make profit, whose goal is to be media literate as you share. The idea of a media literacy kind of manifesto that social media and community organizations can sign on to, so sort of a unified goals that all of these groups can go to. Then take media literacy to where people are looking. TV series, comic book, HBO special, movie, documentary, go to where people are looking already and make it something they see.
Media Literacy Oscars, an award show for media literate organizations, reward this, make it something we're striving for and honorable to have received. And then we sort of played around the idea of a hashtag codebook, sort of like an ever-changing codebook of hashtags that move and rotate enough so that media literacy organizations get them first and can push those ideas before they get co-opted by everyone who's just jumping on to what is trending. And the goal in all of this was to create tangible things. And I think my slideshow disappeared. But yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse and Barbara and the museum team for pie in the sky media literacy programs. Changing people's behaviors to prevent misinfo sharing. Gleb with the Pro-Truth Pledge.
Hey everyone. Hey, can you hear me now? Yes. Excellent, good. That was a great, the previous presentation was a great preparation for this presentation because talking about a badge, the Pro-Truth Pledge is a perfect badge of ways that you can actually mark yourself as being truthful and committed to truthfulness. But I'll mention the Pro-Truth Pledge throughout the presentation, but here the presentation focuses on a broader concept. The Pro-Truth Pledge is only one strategy of getting both private citizens and public figures to prevent the sharing of misinformation by these folks. So how do we do it? The first thing is to look at why people share misinformation. What happens? Why do they share misinformation? Well, there are several reasons according to the research in behavioral science, and that's my area of expertise. There are no penalties for doing it. There are no penalties for sharing misinformation. That's one major reason why people share misinformation. They can still perceive themselves as overall honest when they share misinformation. If they can do that, that contributes to sharing misinformation. If they see others, both their opponents and allies, as sharing misinformation, that makes them more likely to share misinformation. And finally, if they see it as helping their in-group, their tribe, that contributes to sharing misinformation. There are also certain things that discourage the sharing of misinformation. Some of them the flip side of what we talked about. So for example, if we make standards about truthfulness clear, if it's not under doubt, what does it mean to be truthful? What does it mean to be honest? That discourages the sharing of misinformation. A pre-commitment to truthful behavior, like honor codes of various sorts, have been shown to clearly encourage truthfulness. Reminders, various sorts of reminders about what truthful behavior means. Interestingly, there was a study that showed that the 10 Commandments, showing somebody the 10 Commandments makes him or her more likely to be truthful, even if that person is an atheist. It's just a priming of truthfulness. It reminds them of what being truthful means. Perceiving your in-group as discouraging misinformation sharing. That's another factor that is crucial. And finally, having a self-perception, a personal identity as committed to truthfulness. So as some previous group discussed, something like a badge. So for public figures, there's an additional dynamic, and this includes reputational rewards for honesty and reputational penalties for dishonesty. So those two things are additional things that we want public figures and organizations. Those are specifically relevant to them. So what did we come up with? We came up with, first we talked about private citizens, and here are some things for private citizens that are going to be relevant. We want to invest positive emotions into being truthful and encourage vulnerability around truthfulness. So people saying, I don't know, or I'm not sure, being able to admit that right now as opposed to feeling defensive and having to have all the answers. We want to be empathetic, but it's still very important to call out people who share misinformation. Otherwise, there's not going to be any penalties for sharing misinformation. So empathetically calling these people out. We want to show people how sharing misinformation harms their in-group. That might involve reframing who they perceive as their in-group. So for example, if right now people perceive sharing misinformation as benefiting their political cause, their ideology, if we can reframe their in-group as being about the whole country, as being about democracy, as being about protecting the United States of America or other countries in which their context is, that would be helpful. So that's another dynamic. And finally, we want to prime people for cultural reference of truthfulness. So something like The Boy Who Cried Wolf or Pinocchio or something like that. So cultural reference that make them think about truthfulness are going to be helpful. And for public figures, we went on to public figures. Now, broadly speaking, this is applicable to all public figures, all organizations. We thought that social profiles can be rated based on their truthfulness. The pages of public figures, whether people on the left, people on the right, center, whatever, can be rated based on how truthful they are, if there's a rating system of some sorts. And if the whole page can be de-emphasized by social media platforms, if it consistently shares misinformation. So having the whole page, not specific articles be de-emphasized, but the whole page. And finally, we thought about if there can be a reward system for politicians. Right now, we thought about the environmental movement, how it was incredibly successful, created essentially out of nothing in the 1950s and 1960s, became an incredibly successful movement that was really powerful. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published in 1962. In 1970, Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. So really powerful. And if that lobby would reward politicians who are honest by money, volunteer time, and votes. So having something like that. So these are all strategies that we talked about. Now, the Pro-Truth Pledges hits a number of those strategies, but there are so many other things that can be done in this sphere to change people's behavior, change people's incentives, both private citizens and public figures, to help them avoid sharing misinformation. And I hope all of you contribute some ideas and think about how you can change the behavior of people of public figures to encourage them to avoid sharing misinformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gleb, with Pro-Truth Pledge. Thanks, Gleb. We have our penultimate workshop presentation coming up. Standard certification, Scott.
Yeah, it looks like the slides are a little different. Hi, thank you very much. I'm combating the jinx of Kiev because I presented at Kiev about Arkady Babchenko when he was dead, and then I left and he was alive again and setting journalism back 50 years. And so I said to the group, I can't present because of this jinx. And they all said, whatever, get up there and go do the presentation. So anyway, thank you very much. We talked about standards and certification. There were 3 of us. Oh, this is going to be a totally different presentation than I was planning on, because this is a grab from when I submitted it to you. Oh, okay, so it's changed a little bit since then, but all right. So it was organized by 3 groups, which the W3C, CredWeb group, which you can find at credweb.org. Sandro is here, and be sure to talk to him about the involvement of the W3C in the standard setting process for the idea of a more credible web. Reporters Without Borders, known by its French initials RSF. Olaf is here, and you should talk to him about their efforts. And then my organization's the Certified Content Coalition, and you can find out more on the website there. We wanted to start out, we thought we'd be able to do a lot of great work and maybe get through a series of questions, and we realized we could really only get through one question: how to build a hard-to-game journalism standard. And then we came up with one standard, and we thought, we're just going to do this one standard. We're just going to tackle this one, and this is the easiest one. Provide full transparency and identity of revenue. That'll be a standard that we're all going to be able to agree on quickly, and then we'll be able to move on to the next standard. And so we started talking about that one standard, and we realized that it's not at all easy. This was incredibly difficult. There's a bunch of stuff that goes on, and you can go to the Twitter handle, and you can go to MisinfoCon to get the latest version of this, so you don't have to read this. But I can tell you, coming up with standards is incredibly hard. But that being said, it's important to try. It's really hard to come up with these standards, but if we don't do it, somebody else will. Let's see what this slide. Okay, so the new version of this slide is, so this is Erdogan, Putin, and Elon Musk, who would all like to come up with their standards for what journalism is. And so if the smart people in this room decide not to do it just because it's hard, then other people will fill in the vacuum, and that would be really terrible. The new version of the slide has a big arrow on it, and the arrow was pointing this way, and so it's the other people that will try to regulate it are either at that building, if you're looking at these monitors, or in the White House, if you're looking at those monitors. And we don't want either of those to happen. So that's it. The other slide that we have was thanks very much. We had an amazing, amazing group, super, super helpful, and we're very appreciative of having the time to present here. And let's hope now the jinx is broken.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. Our last workshop, IREX, get up here. Solving the citizen side of the equation.
Shouldn't have sat in the back. It's a long wait. Should I use this clicker? Yeah. Green. Okay. So what we did was we led a design thinking workshop with a few groups that were interested in tackling these three themes. So helping citizens separate fact from fiction, helping us measure the impact of our efforts, and helping citizens actively seek quality information. So each of the participants got to choose whichever one of these themes that they wanted to take part in. We had groups of 2 to 3 in each of them. These are the participants having lots of fun with their sticky notes. There you go. And then these were their ideas that they came up with. The purpose of these of this actual workshop was not to come up with ideas that are going to change the world, but to really understand the process that you need to go through in order to try and innovate using design thinking techniques. So the first group came up with a user-driven browser fact checker. The second group, which wanted to measure the impact of our efforts to find misinformation, thought of an incentivized marketplace for citizens to report fake news. And then the last group wanted to increase journalism's responsiveness to people's needs by finding more time and space for them. So these are the main reflections that came out of the workshop. These reflections were from the participants themselves. I can read them. We must avoid the tendency to view users as a monolithic unit. And what this means is we shouldn't just think that all our solutions are going to be adept for everyone around the world. Every solution is contextual, and we need to look at users in that same way. There is a percentage of people who we believe will never change their points of view. So this is more of a question that the participants came up with. Do we want to cater all of our ideas to those people, or do we want to cater it to the rest who we think could go either way still? It is important to consider the incentives for individuals to take part in any process relating to fighting misinformation. This one speaks for itself. And lastly, we should look for solutions that capitalize on platforms whose users comprise the target audience. This basically means once you've figured out who your users are, just find the platforms that they're using right now so you can touch base with them and tackle that group appropriately. Thank you.